Hi everyone, and welcome to Now on Men, the podcast discussing men, masculinities, and gender equality. It's Stephen Burrell here, and I'm coming to you from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation in Naarm, which is the original First Nations name for Melbourne. How are you doing, Sandy?
I'm very well, thank you, Stephen. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned First Nations in Australia. I just found out that two museums here in Oxford, the Pitt Rivers and the Museum of Natural History, they recently returned some ancestral remains to Aboriginal communities. So that's part of our problematic history of archaeology, anthropology, that caused so much hurt and actually does need redress. But how are you doing, Stephen?
Yes, no, I'm well too, thanks, Sandy. Yeah, no, and I think that's a really important point you mentioned. And the reason I mentioned that at the beginning as well is because here in Australia, people often do what's called a kind of acknowledgement of country at the beginning of an event to kind of recognise that we are on kind of unceded lands, which were, of course, colonised as part of the long and painful history of British imperialism that you mentioned, Sandy, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm very excited to have with us Dr Ján Michalko, who's a research fellow in gender equality and social inclusion at ODI, which is an independent global affairs think tank based in London. So Jan is here with us today to talk about a research project called Men in Politics as Agents of Gender Equitable Change, Gender Norms and Political Masculinities. And that's about to be published by ODI's digital ALiGN platform, which stands for Advancing Learning and Innovation on Gender Norms. So ALiGN focuses on increasing understanding of harmful gender norms and how they can be transformed towards gender equality.
Yes, so we're seeing a slowly growing number of men politicians, Emmanuel Macron in France, George Weah in Liberia, Justin Trudeau in Canada, who have labelled themselves, note, and their politics as feminist. The study by Jan and his co-author Matthew Maycock seeks to better understand men in positions of power in politics who claim to be feminist or pro-feminist allies, or otherwise think of themselves as pro-gender equality, and the impact that they have in practice.
Yeah, so hi Jan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
A pleasure, thank you. And could you perhaps start off by telling us a bit more about why you and your colleagues decided to carry out this project in the first place? What were the kind of overall aims and objectives for the research? Like, what were you seeking to achieve with it?
Yeah, I think there were maybe three kind of key drivers or motivations behind the research. I think first was responding to what we have been hearing from some feminists and some feminist movements that we have been working with at ALiGN for some time about the need for men to step up and to do more for gender equality, recognizing that especially at this time where we do have a lot of anti-feminist and anti-gender pushback, backlash, and attacks, we need more people to take up the cause. And of course, historically, it has been women, but it is time that men do more. So that was one of those motivations to kind of respond to that. Being, of course, mindful that there is also danger with that, and I'm sure we will come to talk a little bit about those risks that come with male allyship. I think then the second thing was, of course, then looking into where are the gaps in the current knowledge and literature, and part of it is about men in the positions of power, their masculinities. So we do see, as you kind of rightfully mentioned, these different politicians who are claiming this feminist positionality. There hasn't been much research into them. So we thought that, there is this call, there is this need to learn more, and we don't really know about this specific segment of the male population. So we thought that we could play a role in taking that up. And I think then the last motivation was really tied to being mindful of the fact that there is limited funding and resources that goes towards gender equality work, especially from donors that we would have historically engaged with kind of in the international development sector. So if you think about how much money is spent on gender equality and funding feminist movements, for example, it is very, very little. And so we have to be very mindful of knowing what are the effective strategies to bring gender equitable change, and is working with men in positions of power an area where we should invest more, where we should actually kind of put more energy behind. And so I think we were also motivated by that to say, can we learn something about the different conditions that enable these men to take up that mantle, and are they being effective in transforming, for example, the harmful gender norm? So we wanted to also contribute to that kind of thinking of, we have different pathways to support gender equality. Is this one that could be effective, and we should think about more?
Yeah, and so the data collection itself was actually carried out by teams in Colombia, Liberia, and Malaysia. And there are actually separate case study reports on each country as well. So yeah, we were wondering why you chose to look at these three countries specifically. I mean, could you perhaps give listeners a brief insight into the kind of political situation in each country, perhaps especially relating to kind of gender in politics?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I kind of mentioned before, we are very conscious to feel certain gaps there are in our knowledge. And I think in general, in this field of political masculinities or working with men in politics, most of the research has been driven from the countries of the global north, or we don't really see as much research on this field from the majority world. And so we were very mindful in thinking about countries and geographies where we could support partners to bring new knowledge. And so we focus specifically on those regions. What brings those three countries together is that they all had male leaders over the last 5+ years who have committed or expressed some kind of interest in feminist foreign policy. So, as Sandy mentioned in the introduction, George Weah being the feminist in chief in Liberia and kind of supporting the idea of Liberia having a feminist foreign policy. Colombia currently already has feminist foreign policy since Petro came to power in 2022. In Malaysia, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs has declared interest. And so for us, it was a sign that these countries are actually discussing feminist politics, that there are men who are proclaiming those interests. So those were kind of the starting points. And then we also had a lot of consultations with organizations and researchers in the countries to say, would this be research that is helpful to you, to the advocacy, to the sector? And as a result of those conversations, we actually did also change some of the framing of the research questions to make sure that it kind of fits the local context and that it can be useful for advocacy and fill in the gaps. So those were the criteria. Of course, there are many other countries that have feminist foreign policy. There are different other areas. We also wanted to have a nice diversity, as you mentioned, of the kind of socio-political factors that could potentially shape how men engage with feminist politics or gender equality politics. So if you look at the three countries, they have different experiences of colonialism, for example. They have a different socio-political standing in the global hierarchies and the systems. They have different political systems, because we were also expecting, for example, that the different electoral system and the way you try to get voter support will shape how people feel able to speak out on those different issues, how much they need to speak to the electorate versus, for example, having their own agenda. So those are different considerations, and we wanted to have the diversity. And so these three countries then ended up being in the sample.
It's worth mentioning to listeners that we did in a previous episode with Sebastián Milano talk a little bit about the kind of political context in Colombia after the election of Gustavo Petro and how that was impacting on gender relations. But I suppose another thing I was wondering was that, did you find it difficult to be able to draw generalizations across these three different contexts? Is the situation regarding kind of politics and masculinity quite different from one country to the next, or were there actually commonalities?
We were able to identify some commonalities, but I think you're absolutely right, Stephen, that there are difficulties in making those generalizations. I think also because the research was a qualitative one, we had a small sample. It was based on interviews with some of these men in politics, but also focus groups with students, with activists. We had interviews with women in politics, with activists, academics, because of course there are so many variables that can potentially play a role. And because of the diversity, there is limited generalizability that we can take from it. But I think it shows certain trends. And I think despite the differences of the countries, that the fact that, a lot of the men in politics that we engaged with were kind of refusing to take the feminist label was already an interesting thing, that despite the difference of the context, that there are certain similarities, like the hesitation to engage with feminism, despite the fact that there were these political leaders on the highest level of politics who were proclaiming feminist identity or were discussing feminist politics.
I feel like we could spend the whole podcast talking about the situation in each different country, but you also mentioned there that the key methods were interviewing men in politics and running focus groups in each country. And I wondered about issues of access, really. How easy was it to get the men to talk to researchers, and particularly about masculinity issues, which probably something they may not have thought about very much in the past. So how was that? Getting access, particularly to the politicians.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I will probably have to start by recognizing the amazing work that our colleagues in the 3 countries did. And I hope that the listeners can then go to the country reports and, see all the co-authors of this report. So you mentioned Matt Maycock, who worked with me directly to write this, but we drew on those country reports and on the excellent work that the teams under Fernando, Tanya, and Reen did in the 3 countries. So all of them are well-established researchers on issues of gender and politics. And so, of course, they are already able to access certain politicians. They are part of those spaces. So that facilitated that access to some extent. But of course, it was not easy to do those interviews. And I think part of the small sample is it is such a niche topic that just finding your participants is not easy. And then we had elections in each of the countries during the data collection or kind of around it, whether it was the national or municipal elections. And so with any elite interviews in general, you have people who are too busy to give you the time, or who maybe commit to an interview and then don't show up, and you have to reschedule, etc. So we did have a lot of challenges with that. I thought it was very interesting that, for example, our colleagues and team under Tanya's leadership in Liberia, for example, had some of the men show up with their campaign teams because it was before the election. So they actually came up with the whole team into the interview. So there were limitations, and the flip side of it actually was also because of the election, some took it as an opportunity to demonstrate how great they are on gender equality. They actually took it more of a campaign material, and were quite keen to talk on this issue.
Yeah.
And just maybe final comment on that is that they were maybe more willing to talk about gender equality, women's empowerment. I think the discussion of masculinity as such was limited. And part of it is that, the kind of self-reflection on masculinity or kind of thinking about gender equality as being tied to problems of masculinity in certain contexts or in certain issues wasn't quite present. And I think that ties to the fact that maybe it's not something that they think about quite proactively beyond kind of recognizing that as men, they do have power, they have privilege, and therefore that's why they're interested in maybe helping to be part of the solutions. But the solutions are maybe more for women's empowerment, or to help change the situation for women who they recognize as being harmed or disadvantaged in the current system.
Right, and you said earlier, I think that many of them struggled with taking on the label of feminists. So do you want to say a bit more about why that was, why they didn't want to identify in that way? How do they see themselves?
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons why we kind of maybe broadened a little bit the research questions and the kind of considerations of the research, because at first we wanted to kind of just really focus on men who do self-identify as feminists and kind of say that that's our sample, and we will interrogate their motivations and experiences. But as we kind of co-created the research with the partners, and we kind of started to look at the pool of people, we realized we have to go a little bit broader and kind of engage with men who are working on gender equality more broadly, and kind of then start questioning then, so how do you identify, rather than making the assumption that they would either say I'm a feminist or a pro-feminist or an ally advocate. So we kind of came out more broadly. And as we mentioned, then, there were probably two individuals in our sample who said that they are feminist, they self-identify. There were a few who maybe said that, it's okay if other people see me that way, but I wouldn't necessarily use that label for myself. And a lot of them preferred alternative ways of describing their work, as I mentioned, allies, advocates. And there are some interesting other kind of permutations of that in the different contexts. In Malaysia, our colleagues described, for example, some politicians talking about being humanists, so kind of going beyond one single struggle of gender equality and thinking about, I'm working on justice issues more generally, on human rights for everyone and not only for women. And so they understood gender equality to be part of that kind of bigger picture. And the motivations behind kind of this resistance or refusal to take the feminist identity is kind of on a scale. Some on maybe the seemingly more positive side were more cautious about it because they wanted to recognize the work that women are doing in the feminist movement, that it has been something that they have been doing for many years, and it's kind of a space they want to respect, and so they're staying a little bit cautiously away from that label. This was, for example, very prominent in Colombia, where the feminist movement has had a strong presence and is kind of shaping the political discourse. And then on the complete opposite side of that spectrum, we had men who completely rejected feminism based on kind of their ideological views of what they believed feminism was. So they kind of completely disagreed with it. And so therefore they were more maybe talking about women's rights or working on issues for women because they felt that maybe feminism was talking about women's domination over men, and other stereotypes and myths that some of them kind of internalize to represent feminism.
I guess I'm wondering whether it matters that they didn't call themselves feminists outright. I mean, if they are acting in support of gender equality and women's rights, there's a view that, well, that's pretty important, more important than what you call yourself.
Yeah, and I think we didn't want to pass any judgment on that in the report. I think you're absolutely right. There are some who refuse the label kind of with this feigned respect to feminism, but I think there is a potential question to be asked whether that is an easy way out, because some of them did also mention that, once you claim that identity, you're then being held accountable by the feminist movement to what you're supposed to be doing as a feminist. And maybe for some of them, to avoid that accountability, you avoid identifying the label. So rather than kind of saying, I don't want to co-opt this, I don't want to take this away from the feminist movement or the women who are leading it, I'm more kind of staying away for not being held accountable. And especially, in, for example, Colombia, where you do have a very vocal feminist movement, it would be quite likely that they would be called out for maybe have certain shortcomings. So I think there is also that to be considered, that in a way, maybe it allows us to take less accountability. But I think you're right that in a way it also is possible that, if you're doing the work without the label, that's also very important.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right that there are potential downsides to them signing up as feminists. I mean, there are plenty of men who've fallen from grace, shall we say, and done immense damage actually to men's involvement in gender equality, by not.
And I think that's why it was also important for us to interview women in politics, to interview activists, to also, in a way, triangulate a little bit of what we're hearing from the men in politics, because part of the research, or some of the research questions we had, was also, what do you do as a gender equality champion? How do you demonstrate this commitment to feminism or women's rights, or what it might be? And we wanted to also hear from women in politics, their kind of peers, but also from activists and others, to be able to say, is it really how they're describing or how they understand it, or is it perceived differently? So I think that was also a very important part of the research to hold that mirror to those narratives.
What did you find, Jan, in terms of the kinds of factors that shaped these male politicians' engagement with gender equality? You know, what does the research tell us, I suppose, about what kinds of things might help us to mobilize more men in politics to support gender equality in the future, I guess?
So we ended up kind of categorizing the different factors that shaped these men's engagement with gender equality into kind of three different categories. We looked at the personal level and factors at the personal level, societal, institutional. So just to give a few examples across the three, I think on the personal level, we had maybe to be expected, and what we do see in some of the other allyship literature is experiences with women, strong feminist women in their lives who have kind of showed them why gender equality matters. You know, for example, in Liberia, our colleagues were mentioning the role that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president, has played in kind of for normalizing the fact that women are in politics and that, you know, gender equality in politics is an important topic to some of these men, and they a lot of them have kind of mentioned her in the interviews. Others mentioned their mothers, their partners, so this personal connection. In Colombia, we had a few openly gay or politicians or LGBTQI plus members who described their other struggles and, of course, their understanding of gender inequality and kind of that being a motivational or personal factor that made them understand and appreciate feminism and go behind it. And there are a few others on the personal level. For example, the level of knowledge that they would have on feminism and masculinities in their particular countries. On the societal level, the factors there really tied to, for example, how they perceived what their voters or what the society is expecting of them, and what are the discourses there. And so there we look into the narratives of westernization and kind of push back against the idea that feminism is a Western import, or gender equality in general as a topic is something that is coming from the West. And, you know, we have some politicians who kind of embrace that and kind of say, well, as part of my kind of progressive identity as a politician, I'm embracing this kind of westernization narrative of gender equality. Others are maybe saying that actually it's incompatible. Feminism and gender equality narratives are kind of incompatible with what it means to be Malay, or kind of tied to the religious identity as well. And so we had these calculations. And I think it's quite helpful to think about these men's decisions as these kind of calculations in order to make the decision whether they take it up. You know, you have those personal feelings, motivations, values, but then you put it in the context of the society, what you perceive there to be. And then the political institutional context, of course, where we saw some of those factors being, you know, their fellow peers. We know from research on gender norms in general that, you know, the kind of peer pressure maintains gender norms. And so, you know, if you're kind of then being attacked for, you know, not being masculine enough for taking up a certain issue, or if you're kind of then feeling that you cannot speak up on your fellow MPs who are, you know, maybe saying something misogynist, because of that culture in political parties, because of that unspoken expectation and rules in parties. So those are some of the institutional factors that shaped their decisions of how to engage. And so we saw something, you know, across the three, and they kind of interacted with one another, these different sets.
Yeah, and was there a kind of pattern in terms of, because I suppose you might, you know, assume that kind of more progressive left-wing parties might be more likely to you know, that men in these parties might be more likely to support gender equality, although on the other hand, you know, perhaps it can't be assumed that those parties will actually, you know, be trusted in that regard. But yeah, did you find any patterns there? Like, is that a reasonable assumption to make, or is it more complicated than that?
It is a little bit more complicated than that, unfortunately. I think, you know, there, as I mentioned, some of the limitations of the research are, of course, that not in every country we were able to get access to politicians across all of the political spectrum. And at the same time, actually, you know, we have to be mindful of not necessarily imposing a certain Western lens of how parties should operate and how they are categorized. So, for example, in Liberia, we don't really have this kind of left-right spectrum of political parties, and a lot of the political parties don't operate either on that language or on that kind of politics. And so trying to kind of create linkages across the three countries, which have very different ways of operating, that wasn't quite possible. So it didn't quite fit neatly to say that, in Colombia, on the spectrum of left to right, we saw this, and the same then kind of repeats in the other countries. So it wasn't quite as neat as that, and I think future research would be very helpful to go much more in depth into the political parties. But one thing that does come through and we had politicians across the spectrum. So we had politicians who kind of supported gender equality across the different parties. But what did come through in general is that, if there is a congruence between the ideology of the party, or if the party itself puts importance on gender equality, it becomes easier for these politicians then, of course, to take up the issue themselves. So I think I would maybe more think about it in that way, in terms of the political agenda or the platform of the party, and of course then political will and leadership within the parties. I think we also have to recognize that matters to a great extent. Is that, how supported are you by the political elite or on the top of the party? So those would be maybe some of the caveats, that it is a little bit more complicated than left.
And you mentioned earlier that the political cycle is pretty important too, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other part to the political cycle, of course, is from the focus group discussions we had with the students, which was very interesting to kind of get their sense of how they view politics, and how do they perceive these men. A thing that came very strongly was this kind of skepticism and a little bit of distrust in the politicians and in their authentic, genuine commitment to gender equality, because believing that a lot of it is just rhetoric as part of the campaigns. So no matter where kind of the cycle is, but there is this kind of perception that maybe the politicians really are talking to gender equality issues because they want women's votes. And they actually then really are not delivering on that rhetoric or on those promises. So I think that definitely plays a big role in how these men are perceived. And it was interesting that the men themselves in the interviews did not necessarily talk about the general issue of lack of political trust, or kind of the maybe crisis of legitimacy in some of the context, as a factor that would affect their kind of engagement with gender equality. But it kind of came out more strongly from the other sources of the data that, it does influence how these men in power are perceived, because allies in general are, of course, groups of people who are in positions of power, who decide to kind of address the issue of the power inequalities. But why would you want to change a system that privileges you, is the key question. And I think for men in politics, the extra layer is that it's not only that you're privileged and empowered as men, but also because you are in positions of power. And as a politician, you enter a position of power and you want to stay in power. So why would you take up an issue of dismantling the system? So there was a lot of skepticism and a little bit of distrust that comes, which makes it more difficult for these men to be able to drive the gender equality change, because they are kind of already on the back footing in a way.
So you mentioned, Jan, that your colleagues also ran some focus groups in each of the three countries. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about who participated in the focus groups? Yeah, and what kind of things did they have to say about the men politicians and their work? You mentioned already that they were perhaps a bit suspicious at times about their claims to support gender equality. Yeah, I mean, were they saying particular things about what they wanted to see these men doing? Yeah.
So we ran the focus groups with students at the university. So all our colleagues across the three countries are embedded at different university institutions, and we wanted to speak to young people, kind of recognizing their importance for future of democracy. I think, thinking about men in politics and their impact, I think one thing is that, of course, we wanted to to see how they're relating and how they're changing potentially the norms of what it means to be a political leader. And so young people's perceptions of these men are very important for their willingness and excitement to be part of the democratic process. So we wanted to speak to these young people, and also because young people do get influenced by role models. I mean, we all do at all stages of our lives, but to a different extent at different stages of our lives. And so we also were thinking that maybe especially the men in the focus groups would, see these men who are maybe demonstrating more gender equitable masculinities as people to look up to imitate, to mimic. And so it was a big and important part of our research. I think in addition to the skepticism that came through, there was a recognition, despite that skepticism, that the men in politics do play an important role. And I think that was something that also came through with the activists and the women in politics with whom we did interviews as well, is that, despite all the shortcomings and the potential insufficiencies and challenges, they are a potential force for good, that they, because of the power that they hold in those institutions, it is critical that we engage them in the process. And so I think that there was that recognition that, maybe they are still not challenging the misogyny in politics enough, that the culture of politics is still seen as very harmful, but that we still need to look to them as actors of change. I think another interesting thing that came through was that the level of politicization of the students was maybe one of the things that mediated, or the kind of the feminist consciousness, maybe I would call it, of the students, kind of shaped how they perceived the politician. So it wouldn't necessarily be an easy men versus women split, saying that, maybe the men were automatically more forgiving and gave more of a leeway to the politicians, and women were more critical. I think the kind of level of politicization mattered. And so, for example, in Colombia, we saw that both men and women were quite critical. Maybe some women in Malaysia, I think they understood gender equality much more. And I think it was interesting that our researchers in Malaysia kind of picked up on the difference, that even their male students who wanted to be part of the focus groups still did not maybe fully understand some of the issues of gender equality. So the women definitely did. But I think their level of criticism against these politicians maybe wasn't quite as strong, because not all of them necessarily identified as feminists themselves.
You mentioned earlier in our chat that there is obviously a significant anti-gender, anti-feminist mobilization in many countries, and we know that there's the rise of patriarchal hard men, so leaders such as Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, and given that background, I'm kind of wondering what priority should be given to increasing men's support, allyship at this time. I take it from what you said that it is important to do that, but what level of priority should it have given the wider context and the other things that one can be getting on with,
I think
supporting the feminist movement, etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a challenging question, and I don't think that the report necessarily gives a straightforward answer. We did not set out in the research to assess, for example, the specific impact of those men in politics that we were interviewing. So you wouldn't necessarily find in the research the kind of focus on what we sometimes call the substantive representation. What is it that they actually did? In the Liberian case, one of the selection criteria for the men that were interviewed was that they supported the gender quota bill in parliament. So there was a bill to have 30% quota, which did not pass. But one of the selection factors for our team there was to look at the men who voted in favor. But we did not get out to kind of assess, how impactful they were. And so there isn't really a clear sense of saying, all these men have achieved this, and therefore kind of it makes financial investment for donors to support more on this. I think it does suggest that we need to do more work with these men and to be able to actually see what could be an effective way, and whether it makes kind of a sense to do much more programmatically and dedicate more time and resources to this, because they are scarce. So I would also encourage the readers who are practitioners, who work, for example, with political parties, who do a lot of capacity building efforts with these politicians, to take up the cause. I mean, we have wonderful programs that work with women in politics to kind of upskill them, to give them the, for example, how to campaign, how to fundraise, because those are those systematic obstacles that they face in order to make it in politics. But I think there is also a case to say, can we pilot and try and test certain things with the men in politics? For example, to do capacity building or knowledge increasing on feminism, to demystify it, so that that they aren't those preconceived notion of what it is. And so if we have more programs like these, we will be able to better assess how effective they are. Because at the moment there isn't that much happening, and this research didn't necessarily look into that, but it suggested that people feel that there is a big role for them to play. And so, yeah, I think that there is definitely scope to explore that.
And you do talk in the report about what you see as sort of enablers or barriers to progress in relation to gender equality more generally, and specifically in relation to this issue, don't you?
Yeah, and I think for example, when you mentioned the feminist movements as one of the kind of avenues to support change is, of course, to fund feminist movements, and there's great amount of evidence to show that feminist movements have been critical in achieving gender equality everywhere around the world. And so I think a lot of the work that we do at ALiGN does, for example, demonstrate the role. And I think this research does that as well. And in a way, we see that in countries like Colombia, where there is the big presence of the feminist movement, and as well where there is a conversation about masculinity through the feminist movement, it has become normalized. It becomes a subject of public conversation. So I think it's not a question of either or, that you kind of invest only in kind of this pathway of change through male leaders, but I think it is very much in work with feminist movements. And again, the research kind of built on the knowledge we have about allyship in general, where organizations like Men Engage Alliance, part of their work is to look into, or having this kind of accountability framework, where it is about change with the feminist movements, that you hold yourself accountable to the feminist movements. And I think that's something that is coming out here as well, is that creating those linkages and those conversations between these men, who in interesting ways, I think in some countries, I think it was in Malaysia in particular, some of the men raised that they maybe don't feel that they can enter that space and have those conversations. And I think the onus is on them as well to kind of make that effort. But I think there is something about creating those linkages and creating networks and connections for the men themselves to have the conversations about themselves, so that they don't feel that alone, that there is that kind of critical mass almost, but also to create those networks and spaces with the feminist movements, to learn and to kind of progress the agenda in an accountable way.
Yeah, I mean, you've probably answered this question, but I wanted to ask also what sort of meaningful actions and strategies can be used by men in politics to enable gender equality. Do you want to say any more about that?
Maybe I'll just use an example to demonstrate what some of the men mentioned. So in Malaysia, some of the politicians, for example, mentioned that there's this kind of informal rule, a norm in an institution of the political parties and the parliament, where men don't speak out in public against one another if there is some kind of a misogyny incident. And the report does bring up a few examples of violence against women in politics, or in kind of gender-based violence in the public sphere. And that there hasn't really been the response that you would hope for men politicians to kind of speak up, and kind of say that it's not right and it's inappropriate. You actually have a lot of the male MPs who participate in this. There is this very misogynist culture in the political institutions. And so I think one of the things to consider for the men, for example, who are in those institutions, is to transform them. We know from some feminist political science research that, of course, institutions really matter in kind of upkeeping the what some scholars like Rainbow Murray and Ellen Bjørngard talk about is this kind of overrepresentation and dominance of men. So rather than framing it as an underrepresentation of women in politics, there are these informal rules and norms that maintain these institutions. And so I think the men who are in these institutions very much can start changing the culture and the kind of the unspoken norms, such as like not speaking out against one another, or how do we hold each other accountable. So it's not only on women MPs or women politicians to kind of stand up for one another, whether it's online or offline.
Right. So you do think basically that men in politics can have influence on the institutions, on the political discourse, on voters, parties, and so
Yeah,
on.
absolutely, absolutely, and I think that there is a huge potential, and I think it was great to kind of see that everyone across the board, the people we spoke to, that see the potential. I think there is a lot of work to live up to it. Still needs to be done, but I think that the potential was recognized. From that role modeling and from that public discourse, because even what you mentioned earlier, Sandy, some of the men that we have Donald Trump, being the often example. But I think even if we don't quite set up the bar as high as Donald Trump, I think we can find it in other men as well who, do influence the public discourse very much so by the proclamations that they make. And I think it is important that the other voices kind of also enter the arena and speak up on those issues, so that the space is not dominated by these men. And I think that was part of the research findings as well, is that one of the reasons why the young people, for example, perceived the system to be still very patriarchal and misogynist was because there are only very few men who are kind of visibly voicing their support for gender equality and kind of and also living and performing these feminist values rather than just kind of claiming the label. So I think we do definitely need more men to kind of turn the tide, really, because the anti-gender and anti-feminist voices are very loud at the present.
Yeah, so it's almost like a kind of dual responsibility, isn't it? That both in terms of course, implementing policies and legislation which creates change in terms of gender equality, but also working to shift the culture inside politics. I mean, I'm thinking about, here in Australia, for example, how in recent years it's really, the spotlight has been shone on politics here and how misogyny is so entrenched. Like a woman, Brittany Higgins, was raped in Parliament, a few years ago by a member of staff in the Liberal Party, just as an example, So, but and I suppose connected to that, I was just going back to something you mentioned right at the beginning of the conversation about how perhaps the men you spoke to, the men in politics, they might have been willing to talk about creating change to support women and help women, as it were, but perhaps weren't as willing to reflect on issues of masculinity and their own masculinity. They didn't seem particularly willing to actually try and embody a different way of being a man. Do you want to talk a bit more about that? Perhaps about the role that men in politics could play there, by embodying the change we want to see, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, for bringing that up again. I think that was one of the kind of, if listeners look at the structure of the report, you'll see kind of in the background theoretical section was that we entered into the research thinking that there are kind of this dual approach to change. One being more in these kind of performances of masculinity, and I think maybe the stereotypical example that comes to my mind is to think about somebody like former President Barack Obama, who cried multiple times in this kind of public spaces, kind of expressing his emotions. When we talked about gun violence in the U.S., for example, kind of those performances of different ways of being a man. So we expected that would be part of the kind of perceptions of these men in politics. That as a feminist man, maybe you kind of perform a different type of masculinity, and then the second stream would be more of these kind of, are you maybe supporting certain laws? Are you supporting other women to go up in the hierarchies of leadership of the political party, taking them as women candidates, which was much more what we heard from the politicians and much less about these kind of performances. in the interviews, there are a few examples where, for example, a politician in Malaysia mentioned that, he tries in his home personal life, to be home for dinner with his children and to do more of the kind of involved father figure gender role. And so I think there is some reflection on masculinity and positions that these men have, and we can think about it kind of as a scale probably, or levels of depth of understanding and engagement with the issue. Because as I mentioned in the beginning, there is that recognition that they have a certain privilege, that they have a certain position as gendered beings, but kind of the different layers and what it means is still lacking. And I think that's why one of the interventions we can think about is kind of raising the awareness. We know from other intervention programs that work maybe on GBV prevention at the community level, or if you look at a lot of research that you can also find on the ALiGN website, is to kind of think about these critical reflection programs, or husband schools and other interventions where you take men on this journey of understanding of power. And I think there is something that we can think about that for men in positions of power, where we haven't been doing these kind of programs for them to understand, to go beyond the kind of basic level and to think much more critically about masculinity. And then maybe even then on the policy level to think about interventions that challenge masculinities that are unequal. Because a lot of the interventions they would be supporting, for example, on women's economic empowerment, would be with that intention of saying, like, how can we support women rather than how can we maybe transform the masculine norms, or how do the masculine norms need to be addressed through policy. So I think those are different areas we definitely can have further work.
You've prompted me to ask a little bit about your own story, Jan. And, we like to ask a personal question or two if we can, but feel free to answer in whatever way you wish. But what led you to get involved in doing this work in the first place?
Yeah. I thought you were going to ask me, Sandy, if I'm a feminist, and if I accept the label.
Well, you can answer that one too if you like, but I mean, it's...
No. But I thought that's where it was going to go. But because it's interesting, like some of the men that were part of the research actually, maybe didn't self-identify, but they said, oh, well, if somebody else labels me that's their prerogative, so they can do that. But maybe I don't. But so my I guess background into this topic. I'm actually relatively new to masculinities research, to admit. I have a background in gender studies, but I started very much maybe similar to the men that we were interviewing for the research in the kind of women's empowerment side of gender equality research. So I was very much also similar to the politicians, influenced by women in my personal life. I come from a family with a very strong, well-educated, opinionated, hardworking women. And so for me, it was always strange that there is inequality and undermining of these women, where I've in my personal life seen how exceptional and great they are. So that kind of entry into the conversation was very much through that if my personal connections are so great, then why are we having this system where all the women aren't given that kind of same opportunity as I am? So there are some of those similarities with the men in the research. But then the pathway to masculinities through that trajectory really came here at ODI. I have to kind of thank my team for giving that kind of recognition of the importance of the topic, to be able to pursue it and kind of contribute to that research and have the space to engage. And then also a personal level question, or a personal level consideration there is that for many years I was very uncomfortable with going into the masculinities research because of my own positionality. I come from, I'm originally from Slovakia, so I come from a very conservative Christian society, where being a feminine man, being a gay person, I struggled very much with kind of going into questions of masculinity. So it took me a very long time to be able to kind of bring the personal into the research, and kind of being able to say, well, if I'm researching gender equality and I go into masculinities, then I bring my full self into those conversations. And I know that a lot of the researchers don't like to do that, but I think it is a good practice to kind of recognize our positionalities. And our colleagues in the research did it as well. I think it was very, very interesting that, for example, our colleagues in Malaysia were three women feminist researchers who went into the conversations with the men in politics, a lot of whom were treating them. I think if you were to read the interview transcripts, I think you would realize what kind of experience they faced from some of these men, and some of the students as well, the kind of rhetoric that they experience. So I think it was great that they brought themselves to the research process and recognized their positionality. And then I'm very happy to be able to do that myself here. But it has been a process for sure to go into that.
Oh, well, thank you so much for talking so honestly there about your own, trajectory, and, fascinating about the process of the research as well, and what's actually going on in those encounters, and the outcomes that you've been talking about. I mean, I really very grateful to you for coming on and talking about ODI's new research. So I hope and encourage people to go and look it up when it comes out.
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for that opportunity and for the interest. And I do hope that people will see the research and come to our website.
Yeah, and we'll put the links in the show notes, but also I would encourage people to check out the ALiGN platform, because there's a treasure trove of resources there. So thank you so much, Jan, for giving up your time to speak to us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.
Yeah, bye-bye. Well, Sandy, I think that's such an important topic we discussed with Jan there, really, isn't it? Because I think for those of us working in the field of kind of engaging with men and boys about gender equality issues, perhaps the focus is often, on young men, for example. And perhaps we should be talking a lot more about actually, how can we reach out to those men who are in positions of real power and influence, where they have the potential to make a lot of change. So I think that does show the importance of the kind of research that ALiGN have done here. What did you make of the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Stephen. I was thinking as we were talking about a conversation I actually had with left-wing Labour MP Tony Benn. This is many years ago now, where, and he always said when he was on public platforms, I'm so interested in people and talking to people and so on and so forth. And when I got to talk to him, he said, and what do you do? And I said, I work on masculinities. And, just for a second, he was actually stumped by that, And I think, when I explained what I meant by that, then we were off. But initially, it sort of crossed his brow, and you thought, "Oh, he doesn't really know what to say to me now. He'd much prefer it if I did a sort of a more standard type of job." But to be fair to him, I mean, if you actually read his later diaries, there's quite a lot in there about looking after his very ill wife who died younger than him, and being a carer. And that as a man, what was that like? And also being influenced by his quite famous daughter, Melissa Benn, as well. So I'll give him his due there, but it was a funny moment, really. And I was also thinking, just talking about politicians in the UK, about some interviewing that I've done in the past for an organisation called the History of Parliament Trust, and one of their projects is an oral history project where they talk to politicians later in life once they've effectively left power. I mean, some of them never leave power, of course, but and those interviews then go into the British Library. So it's like a register of politicians' lives. And I talked to a left-wing Labour MP for that project called Peter Jackson. He was an MP in Derbyshire, and he talked very movingly about an abortion case that he knew the history of, and he actually was tearful during the interview. I mean, it was quite a moment for me, and he acted as sort of unofficial Labour whip on the abortion bill as it was going through Parliament in the late 1960s in the UK Parliament. And I suppose it made me reflect on, how was it that at that time, when the Parliament was absolutely dominated by men, I mean, it was really only when Tony Blair came in that, a significant number of women came into Parliament. So at a time when the Parliament was dominated by men, there was actually quite progressive legislation went through, not just on abortion, but also decriminalisation of homosexuality and so on. And so it would be so interesting to understand better the lives of those male politicians, at that time, and what drove them to take action in favour of women's rights. But that comes back to Ján's point, that actually that feels much more comfortable for male politicians than addressing directly some of the issues around masculinity and power. So, just a few reflections,
absolutely.
Really.
Yeah, well, that gets me thinking about the situation here in Australia currently, because there has been a real groundswell of kind of public anger, really, about just the sheer, ongoing pervasiveness of men's violence against women here after a series of really horrific murders. And actually, you have seen several, high-profile male politicians, including the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, speaking out about this and saying, men need to step up, and actually we as men are part of the solution, which is obviously really good to see. But even then, it feels like, there hasn't been much beyond that. There hasn't been much detail about what men need to do when they do step up, and there hasn't perhaps been much of that critical reflection that Ján talked about the role of masculinity in all of this, and how we as men do need to change, in ourselves, in our own behaviours, and also to create change, where we do have power, and not least, if you're a politician in terms of policy and legislation. So I think it does show, doesn't it, that there's a lot of work there's a lot more that needs to be done there. Yeah. But it also made me think about Ján's, another comment he made about the findings from the research, that it's something that's come up in research we've done, which I'm sure we've mentioned in the past, about how often it is actually women in men's lives who play a really transformative role for them in helping them to understand these issues better. So I think it shows, doesn't it, that if we're talking about engaging men, often women do have a huge impact on men in their lives, and that is often the key thing that really does bring them on board in thinking more critically about these things.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there's part of me reflecting on what you just said, that a lot of the trajectory is going in the wrong direction, really. I mean, we mentioned on the podcast some of the sort of, politics of people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Putin and so on, and I'm thinking about, the COVID inquiry in the UK that's been going on, and some of the appalling sort of discriminatory and, pretty much abusive language and behaviours that were displayed, by Johnson and some of his team during the COVID period, which all came to light at the inquiry. I mean, it's as if men with power have become more brazen, actually, about, some of this stuff, rather than more reflective, which just goes to prove why Ján's research is so important, and why hopefully there may be some follow-up to actually generate some discussion about these issues, not just in those countries where they've done the research, but also in the global north as well. I mean, it's clearly very, very much needed.
And the real need for men, in any position of power or influence, to really play a role in changing these cultures, because they're so harmful for all of us in the end, aren't they? I mean, I could just finish with a question, which is, Ján's point about politicians as role models, I think, is interesting. To what extent are they role models for the rest of us? Or is a role model your dad? People who've listened to this podcast before will know I'm a little bit sceptical about the whole notion of role modelling, but I do think there's some interesting questions in there to leave you with. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, everybody, as always, for listening. If you haven't already, do subscribe to Now and Men, and leave a review if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and share us with your friends and colleagues. Do contact us at nowandmen@gmail.com if you have any feedback or questions for us, and we'll be back with another episode soon. Thank you so much, and take care, Sandy, and take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and speak to you soon.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.